a little bit last week, and we're going to go through chapter 3, verse 20. And if you're taking notes, write that down. That's the section that we're going to try to understand today. And there's some very difficult things in it. There's things that we could spend weeks on in it, but we want to get the big overview of chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 3, verse 20. And what I would entitle that section is that there's no one righteous. That's what Paul sums it up as. So that's what we're going to try to figure out this morning. Now, the groups that we're going to be in, the first group is the one we talked about last week. The ones who are without God have decided that they will not admit there's a God, they will not honor him. They know there's got to be a God because it's obvious to them from creation and from their conscience and their inborn knowledge of God and all that, but they deny it. And when they deny that, they start down a path that God gives them over to, and that path gets worse and worse. So that's who we talked about last week. Now, those people, complete sinners, they're not here. They're not at our little house church. They're out there somewhere. We all know who they are, because they're horrible people. But they're not here. So that's group one, is those sinners that we discussed from chapter 1, verse 18 through the end of the chapter, verse 32. And they're really bad people. Okay, now one of the groups that's here, let's start with this group over here, this half of the building. You are a group that Paul's going to talk to next. And let's call you the moral group. You are pretty big on morality. You understand how bad those people that we talked about are. And, well, you're better than them. I mean, let's admit it. They're a horrible bunch. But you guys are moral. You follow a moral code. You understand that wherever you got it from your family or from your church or however you inherited it somehow, you understand things are right and things are wrong. Some things are moral and some things are immoral. Okay? And those people that we talked about last week, they're totally immoral. You're obviously better than them. God has got to be pleased with you. Okay? All right, so we got the moral group here. We'll get to you guys later. But the moral group, here's what Paul starts saying to them. And let's go chapter 2, and let's go right to verse 3. Do you suppose, oh man, you who judge those who practice such things, and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Okay. Now, like I said, there's a lot more stuff in here, and we don't have time to get into the depths, so we're going to just hit a few sentences out of here to get the gist of what he's saying. So we've got a morality group that knows how bad those immoral people are and feels pretty good about yourselves. And what Paul says to this group is, do you suppose, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Verse 6, he will render to each one according to his works. Verse 12, for all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. Jump down to verse 16, the last phrase, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. All right, now let me kind of summarize that. You moral folks who know you're so much better than the immoral, and you are. If you're thinking that that makes you righteous in God's sight, He's going to judge, and He knows all your secrets. So I know what I see, you're better than those folks out there. But are you perfect? Okay. If you're relying on your morality to make you righteous in God's sight, have you got it all perfect? The answer is no. Okay. And what Paul's pointing out to this moral group is that, okay, it's easy to judge that you're better than them, and you are in some ways, but you do some of the stuff they do. Maybe in a different degree, maybe not quite as openly, but if you're not perfectly moral, then you're in the same boat they are. And what's going to happen is God's going to judge, and He knows your secrets. Okay? So that's His message to this group. Now, that means those folks out there need righteousness from God, which is what He said in verse 17 we're talking about. And even though you look pretty good to us and maybe to yourself, you need righteousness from God. Okay? So that's the moral group. Now, then he turns in chapter 2 and verse 17 to talk to you folks who are the religious folks. You're not just moral. I mean, these folks over here are moral. They may not go to church, they may not have a religion, but they're good folks. You guys go to church. In Paul's terms, you're Jews, because that was the religious group in those days. So he starts in on especially the Jews, but let's just consider it religious folks. Verse 17, look what he says. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know His will and approve what is excellent because you're instructed from the law. Okay, see what he's saying? These moral folks are okay, they're good folks, but they don't really understand God. They don't know what the Bible says. They hadn't got that kind of heritage. We've got this heritage. We boast in God. We know the one true God. Okay? We've got the law. We've been instructed from the law. We know His will. See how much better that is than these plain old moral folks over here? Paul says, okay, now if you're like that, if you think this is your argument, if this is your excuse about why you're righteous in God's sight compared to those horrible people out there and these just moral people but not religious folks, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know His will and approve what is excellent because you're instructed from the law, if that's you, then do you keep it perfect? Okay. They've got a moral standard that they don't keep perfect. Well, you've got the Bible, you've got the law, you've got God's will. Do you keep it perfect? That's what he gets into down here. He says, you preach against stealing. Well, do you steal? You say, well, no, I'm not a burglar. No. Do you ever have a little bit of dishonesty on anything? Anywhere, anytime, any place. You say you're not supposed to commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Well, no, I've never cheated on my spouse. What? Yeah, but do you ever have lustful things in your life? And he goes on and lists some other things. And what he's really saying is, okay, you got the law. There are people today that say, okay, there's people over in this camp. They say, well, all you got to do is keep the Ten Commandments. Okay. Well, you ask those folks, well, what are the Ten Commandments? They might name 2 of them. They don't know the other 8. And if you did know all 10 of them, you ask them, have you kept those perfectly? Well, no. And you who claim to be religious and know the law and know God's will and all that, well, if that's what you're counting on, have you kept it perfectly? And the answer is, well, no. Now, it's a little deeper than that because he throws some things in there that the Jews, the religious folks, trusted in over just being moral. Okay? The first is their heritage. They grew up this way. They became a Jew at 8 days old. They were born into it. They're descended from Abraham. Okay? They got all this going for them. They got this amazing heritage. They are God's chosen people. They've got this knowledge. He says, you've been instructed from the law. You know his will. You rely on the law. So they've got this knowledge of who God is and what he wants. And then he gets around to the outward signs, the ceremonies, if you will, especially circumcision. Okay? The Jews trusted in that. They said, that's what I've been circumcised. Well, I'm righteous in God's sight. Okay. So he throws all those things in there, and then he gets into a little discussion on circumcision, which we're going to take a little side trip here and talk about that in today's terms, I guess. Verse 25 through 29 is a favorite passage of the faith-only folks. Okay? Now, we don't have to go into all that. I think everybody that's in this class probably knows what we're talking about. But from the time of Luther on and a reaction to works-only righteousness, Luther swung the pendulum over, and others in that day, to faith only. Okay? And there's no work that you can do, and since baptism is something that is beyond just pure believing, supposedly, then baptism isn't necessary. It's just faith only. Okay, so the people that teach that have been taught that, and therefore teach it, they love verse 25 through 29. Okay, let's just read that, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. It says, for circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who's uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Okay, now, admittedly, Paul goes lots of places. That's just Paul's style. Reading this whole passage that we're working through today, the reason I'm just hitting a few sentences out of it is because Paul goes all these different places. You know, they're all right and they're all helpful if you got time to delve into them, but if you can pick out his main message. In fact, when I was reading through this and thinking about it, this may be a strange comparison to you, but the Apostle Paul's a little bit like President Trump. You know, you ask him a question, and he may answer the question, but he goes a whole lot of places. He goes all over. He bounces around. I think Paul's a little more focused than he is, but Paul goes a lot of places. Okay? And in this argument about you Jews, who you've got the law, you got the heritage, you know what God's will is, all that, you've been circumcised, all that. He takes off on this little tangent here about, okay, now circumcision, if you got nothing else going, you know, if that's it, then that doesn't really count. If you don't act like a Jew, if you don't believe like a Jew, if you don't think like a Jew, if you don't really understand God and all that, if you could just say, I'm circumcised, well, that's not enough. You got to be a Jew inwardly. Okay, so faith-only people love this little passage, and what they do is a very slick little trick. They say, aha, circumcision's just like baptism. Okay. And since Paul says, if you don't have any inward backup to being a Jew, if you don't have anything in your heart and all of that, then circumcision doesn't count. So they make this little leap that, okay, if circumcision is like baptism, then baptism's not important. Okay? That's a trick. They're not playing fair. Okay? They're not reading what they read here. Okay? What's Paul say about circumcision? Well, let's back up just a second. What they say is true if somebody has absolutely no faith and has only been baptized, then I agree that's useless. Okay? There are people like that. Okay? There are people who've been told, well, you've got to get baptized. Okay, and they do that, and they don't understand what they're doing or why, or they're not committed. They make no decision to follow Jesus or change their life. There's no repentance involved. In that case, I understand. Yes, baptism's not going to save you. Okay? My comeback for that usually, if we believed in water regeneration, if we believed that just putting you under the water saved you, we got enough big guys in here, we could save everybody. Okay? We would put you under the water, whether you liked it or not. Okay? But we don't believe that. We believe it's a matter of the heart, just exactly like Paul said. But look at what Paul went right ahead and said. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what's the value of circumcision? What's his answer? Much in every way. Circumcision is very important. Okay? If that's what you're trusting in and you don't have anything else, well, that's not good enough. But it's very, very important. And if you think circumcision not important, not necessary, you might go back and check Exodus chapter 4. Moses was told to circumcise his son, and he didn't do it. What was God's reaction? He told Moses, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you if you don't follow this order. You think God thinks circumcision may be of much value? Yeah, that story's in there. That's how serious it is. Okay, so to take this little side trip that Paul goes on about circumcision, and first of all, to compare it exactly to baptism is not fair, because circumcision was done to people who didn't have any idea what they were doing. They were 8 days old. Baptism is made by adults or believing adults that have a conscious decision. So there are a whole lot of differences, but not fair to use that as a faith-only argument. Okay, let's get back on track here. We took that side trip. Okay, so Paul finishes talking to the Jews here and says, if you're going to rely on the law, then, okay, have you kept it perfectly or not? The answer is no. Well, then that doesn't work for you either. Okay, so now before we get to the verdict, let's reposition ourselves here. Paul started this letter to the church in Rome. He greeted them. He told them how much he loved them and all that. And then he said in verse 17 of chapter 1, he said, what I'm going to tell you about is a righteousness from God. A righteousness from God. And then in verse 18, he starts to this passage about why everybody needs this righteousness from God. And he says, first of all, there's the immoral folks that are out there. They're a horrible mess. They need a righteousness from God. And you folks who think you're moral, you're not perfectly moral, so that's not going to do it, so you need a righteousness from God. Okay? And you folks who've got the heritage and the knowledge and the lineage of being a Jew and the outward signs and all of that, since you don't keep the law perfectly, you need a righteousness from God. Okay? So he's said all of that. Now he gets to the verdict. He wraps it up, chapter 3, verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we've already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As it's written, none is righteous. No, not one. Not the folks out there, not the moral folks, not the religious folks. Nobody's righteous by their efforts. And what he does next is he quotes a bunch of Old Testament passages, 5 different Psalms plus something from Isaiah that you Jews will recognize. And what he's saying is, forever you hadn't been righteous. You've never kept the law perfectly. You know, you're not doing it today, and your ancestors never did. Because it's written in what we call the Old Testament, there's no one righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks God. All these different Psalms and Isaiah's prophecies never have kept it right perfectly. Okay? So he goes through all those quotations, and then down in verse 19, he says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Okay? Let's do this real quickly. Every mouth may be stopped. I always just passed over that because I had no idea what he was talking about. And I finally found a commentator that explained it, which I think he may be right. In those days, in public trials, which they had out where everybody could see them, if you were on trial, you defended yourself, and when you had no more to say, when you were all done, you put your hand over your mouth. You stopped your mouth. I'm done. If you'd pretty well been established as guilty and you kept on yapping, kept defending yourself and saying, yeah, but, then the court official would stop your mouth. They would slap you across the face and say, that's enough. The defense rests. Okay? And if you think that's kind of odd, it happened to Jesus and it happened to Paul. Both of them were on trial, and Jesus, when he spoke up and said something, they slapped him across the face. When Paul said something to Ananias the high priest ordered an official to slap Paul across the mouth. Stop your mouth. So Paul, who everybody knows this story, says, now, when the law speaks, if you're under the law, it speaks to you so every mouth may be stopped. Your defense is over. When I ask you the question, have you kept the law perfectly? Unless you said yes, your defense rests. You got no defense. Your answer is no. Okay? So every mouth is stopped from defending that business. Then verse 20 wraps it all up. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Okay? No human effort. Okay? Now, I know he mentions the law, but he's talking about broader law, which we didn't take time to get into, about the Gentiles and they're a law unto themselves and their inborn morality and all that. We might get there next week. But you moral guys, you know what's right and wrong. And you can try as hard as you want to be perfect, you won't get there. And you guys got the advantage of the law. You can try as hard as you want to keep it perfectly, but you won't get there. So what's Paul's conclusion? No one, no human being by their works will be justified. And the next verse is where Romans starts to get good. He's proved everybody needs righteousness from God, and we can't get there by ourselves. So verse 21 of chapter 3, he says, but I'm going to tell you about a righteousness from God. Those folks out there can't get there. You guys can't get there. You guys can't get there. But we got something from God that I want to tell you about. So we'll tackle that next week. The righteousness from God begin in chapter 3, verse 21. Thanks for your attention.